All right, today's presentation is going to be on the big three and little three. And what the big three and little three are is the three most common atoms that we find in living things and the next three most common atoms we find in living things. So carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are the most common things we find in living things. They make up over 90% of living things. And then the other molecules are phosphorus, nitrogen, and sulfur. They make up another few percent of living things. So the big three, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Little three are nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So what we're going to talk about today is kind of like what an atom is and how they bond together and why that's important to life. So an atom is basically made up of a nucleus that's going to have protons and neutrons in it. And it's going to have an electron cloud of electrons moving around the outside. We call it a cloud because they're moving so fast, they kind of appear to be everywhere at once. Atoms can come in a couple different forms. We can have ions of atoms. When they have more or less electrons than they have protons, then we call those an ion. You can also have isotopes, and those are atoms that have different numbers of neutrons in their nucleus compared to normal. So for example, carbon-12 is our normal form of carbon that we find, but carbon-14 is an isotope of carbon. So here's an atom. You got your protons, your positively charged protons, and you got your neutrons that are neutral. And then orbiting the atom at quite a distance from the nucleus. Well, it's a very small distance, but relatively speaking, they're pretty far out there. You have negatively charged electrons, and they will orbit in orbitals. The first orbital will contain just 2 electrons, and then 8, and it goes on and on. There's lots and lots of orbitals in atoms. All right, so chemical reactions are going to take place all the time inside our bodies and on our planet, and they're going to break and form new chemical bonds. And bonds can come in a couple different forms. We're going to talk about a few different forms of chemical bonds. And their importance to life basically is that we constantly have to break things down that we eat and then build things back up into new forms. So I eat protein in one form, but then I have to turn it into, break it down into amino acids and then turn it into the proteins I need to run my body. So the protein might not be the same, exactly the same in, for example, a pork chop that I'm going to use as an enzyme in my body, but I can use those amino acids to make that protein. All right, what types of bonds are we talking about? Well, one of the types of bonds we have is an ionic bond. And ionic bonds happen when you actually have transfer of an electron from one atom to another atom. So this is an example right here of salt, sodium chloride. This would be regular table salt. And you have the transfer of an electron from the outer shell of sodium to the outer shell of chlorine. Now, atoms prefer to have full outer shells. And so if I can move an electron, this one outer shell electron from sodium over to chlorine and fill chlorine's outer shell, now sodium has a full outer shell, chlorine has a full outer shell, and both these atoms are really happy in that situation. And they prefer to be in that situation. And so now we have sodium ions and chloride ions, and because they are opposite charges, negative and positive, they're attracted to each other. This is a fairly weak bond. If you put this into water, the water will pull these molecules apart and they'll form sodium and chloride ions. So they're not real strong bonds. They're held together primarily by opposite charges of the new ions. Covalent bonds are a little bit different. these are a little bit stronger bond, and we're going to be sharing electrons in a covalent bond. And covalent bonds can come in a couple different forms, polar and non-polar. So water is an example of a polar covalent bond. And so I have a shared pair of electrons right here and a shared pair of electrons right here. What happens with polar covalent bonds is I have different charges in the nucleus of the oxygen versus the hydrogen. There's 8 protons here and 1 proton here. And so this has +8 charge and this has +1 charge. Well, if I'm negatively charged, I'm going to be more attracted to +8 than +1. And so I'm going to spend a lot more time orbiting the oxygen than I am the hydrogen. This causes the oxygen to become slightly negative and the hydrogen to become slightly positive. So because we have a positive and a negative end to our atom, we call it polar. It's like a magnet. These will then be attracted to each other. Here's a cool little picture of a water molecule. It's not a real water molecule, but it looks cool. Oops. Well, I don't have it right here, but I'll have it in a minute. These will be attracted to each other in something we call hydrogen bonding, and we'll look at that in just a second. So non-polar covalent bonds are when we have similar charges in the nucleus. In this particular case, they're exactly the same. +8, +8, so the electrons are going to have equal attraction to both. They're going to orbit both of them the same, and so neither one of these is going to have a charge advantage over the other. So we call this a non-polar covalent bond because the electrons orbit both nuclei the same amount. So there's no charge to this molecule. Diatomic molecules like H2, O2, N2, they're always non-polar covalent bonds. So how do we name these things? Well, whether something's non-polar or polar or ionic really is just a matter of, where we say it fits in. Okay, so for something to be considered non-polar, they don't have to have exactly the same electronegativity in each nucleus, but as long as the difference in electronegativity is less than 0.3, okay, then you're going to end up with a non-polar, what we will call a non-polar bond. If we have a difference in electronegativity between 0.3 and 1.7, like if we have a hydrogen and an oxygen, okay, then we end up with a polar covalent bond. And if our difference in electronegativity is either even higher than that, higher than 1.7, okay, usually like in this case, in an ionic bond, it would be 2, okay, because this lost an electron and this gained an electron. So we have a difference of 2. Then we call those ionic bonds. Hydrogen bonds are also going to be really important. They occur when we have polar molecules, and the hydrogen from one atom is attracted to the negatively charged atoms, or one molecule is attracted to the negatively charged atoms in another molecule. So in this particular case, here's water. We have a slightly positively charged hydrogen attracted to a slightly negatively charged oxygen. Okay, so we call that cohesion. It's written up here, cohesion, when we have two molecules that are attracted to each other. Okay, and because hydrogen is usually involved in this situation, we call that hydrogen bonding. Well, it's a hydrogen bond if hydrogen is involved. So what happens because of that is you end up with water beating up on waxy surfaces, and we gave some examples of that when we did our water presentation. We also see hydrogen bonds between the nitrogen bases in DNA. So between A and T, there's 2 hydrogen bonds, and between G and C, there's 3 hydrogen bonds, and that's what holds our double helix together. So hydrogen bonding is super important for life. It gives water a lot of characteristics that are useful for life, and it holds our DNA molecule together, and it's seen in lots of other things. It helps form the shapes of proteins so that they can do their jobs properly. So hydrogen bonding is very common. It's not a super strong bond, but it's a super important And our next presentation will be on all of our carbon-based macromolecules. The reason carbon is such a good molecule for forming all these carbon-based macromolecules is carbon can bind up to 4 other atoms at a time. Think about your old Connex connectors, okay? So right here I have a Connex that can bind in 4 different spots all at once. Okay, actually it could do 8 if I was utilizing it properly. But in this particular case, we'll just say it bound here, 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 and here. This is comparable to what carbon is like in a molecule. Not all the Connex can bind that many different places, but carbon can. And so carbon is a very useful backbone molecule because it can bind in so many places all at once. So it can have lots of attachments in molecules to those carbons. They can form chains and still attach lots of other molecules on the edges of those carbons.